In economics, deflation is a decrease in the general price level of goods and services. Deflation occurs when the inflation rate falls below 0%. Inflation reduces the real value of money over time. Conversely, deflation increases the real value of money, the currency of a national or regional economy. This allows one to buy more goods and services than before with the same amount of money. Economists generally believe that deflation is a problem in a modern economy because it increases the real value of debt, and may aggravate recessions and lead to a deflationary spiral. Deflation is distinct from disinflation, a slowdown in the inflation rate, i.e., when inflation declines to a lower rate but is still positive. Causes and corresponding types. In the SLM model, deflation is caused by a shift in the supply and demand curve for goods and services, particularly a fall in the aggregate level of demand. That is, there is a fall in how much the whole economy is willing to buy, and the going price for goods. Because the price of goods is falling, consumers have an incentive to delay purchases and consumption until prices fall further, which in turn reduces overall economic activity. Since this idles the productive capacity, investment also falls, leading to further reductions in aggregate demand. This is the deflationary spiral. An answer to falling aggregate demand is stimulus, either from the central bank, by expanding the money supply, or by the fiscal authority to increase demand, and to borrow at interest rates which are below those available to private entities. In more recent economic thinking, deflation is related to risk. Where the risk-adjusted return on assets drops to negative, investors and buyers will hoard currency rather than invest it, even in the most solid of securities. This can produce a liquidity trap, or it may lead to shortages that entice investments, yielding more jobs and commodity production. A central bank cannot normally charge negative interest for money, and even charging zero interest often produces less stimulative effect than slightly higher rates of interest. In a closed economy, this is because charging zero interest also means having zero return on government securities, or even negative return on short maturities. In an open economy, it creates a carry trade, and devalues the currency. A devalued currency produces higher prices for imports without necessarily stimulating exports to a like degree. In monetarist theory, deflation must be associated with either a reduction in the money supply, a reduction in the velocity of money, or an increase in the number of transactions. But any of these may occur separately without deflation. It may be attributed to a dramatic contraction of the money supply, or to adherence to a gold standard or other external monetary base requirement. However, deflation is the natural condition of hard currency economies when the supply of money does not grow as quickly as population and the economy. When this happens, the available amount of hard currency per person falls, in effect making money more scarce, and consequently, the purchasing power of each unit of currency increases. Deflation occurs when improvements in production efficiency lower the overall price of goods. Competition in the marketplace often prompts those producers to apply at least some portion of these cost savings into reducing the asking price for the goods. When this happens, consumers pay less for those goods, and consequently deflation has occurred, since purchasing power has increased. Rising productivity and reduced transportation costs created structural deflation during the acceleration productivity era of from 1870 to 1900, but there was mild inflation for about a decade before the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913. There was inflation during World War I, but deflation returned again after that war and during the 1930s depression. Most nations abandoned the gold standard in the 1930s. There is less reason to expect deflation, aside from the collapse of speculative asset classes, under a fiat monetary system with low productivity growth. In mainstream economics, deflation may be caused by a combination of the supply and demand for goods and the supply and demand for money, specifically the supply of money going down and the supply of goods going up. Historic episodes of deflation have often been associated with the supply of goods going up without an increase in the supply of money, or the demand for goods going down combined with a decrease in the money supply. Studies of the Great Depression by Ben Bernanke have indicated that, in response to decreased demand, the Federal Reserve of the time decreased the money supply, hence contributing to deflation. Demand-side causes are growth deflation, an enduring decrease in the real cost of goods and services as the result of technological progress, accompanied by competitive price cuts, resulting in an increase in aggregate demand. A structural deflation existed from the 1870s until the cycle upswing that started in 1895. The deflation was caused by the decrease in the production and distribution costs of goods. It resulted in competitive price cuts when markets were oversupplied. The mild inflation after 1895 was attributed to the increase in gold supply that had been occurring for decades. There was a sharp rise in prices during World War I, but deflation returned at the war's end. By contrast, under a fiat monetary system, there was high productivity growth from the end of World War II until the 1960s, but no deflation. Historically, not all episodes of deflation correspond with periods of poor economic growth. See deflation # scarcity of official money. Productivity and deflation are discussed in a 1940 study by the Brookings Institution that gives productivity by major U.S. industries from 1919 to 1939, along with real and nominal wages. Persistent deflation was clearly understood as being the result of the enormous gains in productivity of the period. By the late 1920s, most goods were oversupplied, which contributed to high unemployment during the Great Depression. Cash-building deflation, attempts to save more cash by a reduction in consumption leading to a decrease in velocity of money. Supply-side causes are bank credit deflation, a decrease in the bank credit supply due to bank failures or increased perceived risk of defaults by private entities, or a contraction of the money supply by the central bank. Debt deflation. Debt deflation is a complicated phenomenon associated with the end of long-term credit cycles. It was proposed as a theory by Irving Fisher to explain the deflation of the Great Depression. Money supply-side deflation. From a monetarist perspective, deflation is caused primarily by a reduction in the velocity of money and/or the amount of money supply per person. A historical analysis of money velocity and monetary base shows an inverse correlation. For a given percentage decrease in the monetary base, the result is nearly equal percentage increase in money velocity. This is to be expected because monetary base, velocity of base money, price level and real output are related by definition. MBVB equals PY. However, it is important to note that the monetary base is a much narrower definition of money than M2 money supply. Additionally, the velocity of the monetary base is interest rate sensitive, the highest velocity being at the highest interest rates. In the early history of the United States, there was no national currency and an insufficient supply of coinage. Banknotes were the majority of the money in circulation. During financial crises, many banks failed and the notes became worthless. Also, banknotes were discounted relative to gold and silver, the discount depending on the financial strength of the bank. In recent years, changes in the money supply have historically taken a long time to show up in the price level, with a rule of thumb lag of at least 18 months. More recently, Alan Greenspan cited the time lag as taking between 12 and 13 quarters. Bonds, equities and commodities have been suggested as reservoirs for buffering changes in money supply. Credit deflation. In modern credit-based economies, deflation may be caused by the central bank initiating higher interest rates, thereby possibly popping an asset bubble. In a credit-based economy, a slowdown or fall in lending leads to less money in circulation, with a further sharp fall in money supply as confidence reduces and velocity weakens, with a consequent sharp fall-off in demand for employment or goods. The fall in demand causes a fall in prices as a supply glut develops. This becomes a deflationary spiral when prices fall below the costs of financing production, or repaying debt levels incurred at the prior price level. Businesses, unable to make enough profit no matter how low they set prices, are then liquidated. Banks get assets which have fallen dramatically in value since the mortgage loan was made, and if they sell those assets, they further glut supply, which only exacerbates the situation. To slow or halt the deflationary spiral, banks will often withhold collecting on non-performing loans. This is often no more than a stopgap measure, because they must then restrict credit, since they do not have money to lend, which further reduces demand, and so on. Historical examples of credit deflation. In the early economic history of the United States, cycles of inflation and deflation correlated with capital flows between regions, with money being loaned from the financial center in the Northeast to the commodity-producing regions of the West and South. In a pro-cyclical manner, prices of commodities rose when capital was flowing in, that is, when banks were willing to lend, and fell in the Depression years of 1818 and 1839 when banks called in loans. Also, there was no national paper currency at the time and there was a scarcity of coins. Most money circulated as banknotes, which typically sold at a discount according to distance from the issuing bank and the bank's perceived financial strength. When banks failed, the notes were redeemed for bank reserves, which often did not result in payment at par value, and sometimes the notes became worthless. Notes of weak surviving banks traded at steep discounts. During the Great Depression, people who owed money to a bank whose deposits had been frozen would sometimes buy bank books at a discount and use them to pay off the debt at par value. Deflation occurred periodically in the U.S. during the 19th century. This deflation was at times caused by technological progress that created significant economic growth, but at other times it was triggered by financial crises, notably the Panic of 1837, which caused deflation through 1844, and the Panic of 1873, which triggered the Long Depression that lasted until 1879. These deflationary periods preceded the establishment of the U.S. Federal Reserve System and its active management of monetary matters. Episodes of deflation have been rare and brief since the Federal Reserve was created, while U.S. economic progress has been unprecedented. A financial crisis in England in 1818 caused banks to call in loans and curtail new lending, draining specie out of the U.S. The Bank of the United States also reduced its lending. Prices for cotton and tobacco fell. The price of agricultural commodities also were pressured by a return of normal harvests following 1816, the year without of summer, that caused large-scale famine and high agricultural prices. There were several causes of the deflation of the severe depression of 1839–43, which included an oversupply of agricultural commodities as new cropland came into production following large federal land sales a few years earlier. Banks requiring payment in gold or silver, the failure of several banks, default by several states on the bonds, and British banks cutting back on specie flow to the U.S. This cycle has been traced out on the broad scale during the Great Depression, partly because of overcapacity and market saturation and partly as a result of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. International trade contracted sharply, severely reducing demand for goods, thereby idling a great deal of capacity and setting off a string of bank failures. A similar situation in Japan, beginning with the stock and real estate market collapse in the early 1990s, was arrested by the Japanese government, preventing the collapse of most banks and taking over direct control of several in the worst condition. Scarcity of official money. The United States had no national paper money until 1862, but these notes were discounted to gold until 1877. There was also a shortage of U.S. minted coins. Foreign coins, such as Mexican silver, were commonly used. At times banknotes were as much as 80% of currency in circulation before the Civil War. In the financial crises of 1818–19 and 1837–41, many banks failed, leaving the money to be redeemed below par value from reserves. Sometimes the notes became worthless, and the notes of weak surviving banks were heavily discounted. The Jackson administration opened branch mints which over time increased the supply of coins. Following the 1848 finding of gold in the Sierra Nevada, enough gold came to market to devalue gold relative to silver. To equalize the value of the two metals in coinage, the U.S. Mint slightly reduced the silver content of new coinage in 1853. When structural deflation appeared in the years following 1870, a common explanation given by various government inquiry committees was a scarcity of gold and silver, although they usually mentioned the changes in industry and trade we now call productivity. However, David A. Wells notes that the U.S. money supply during the period 1879 to 1889 actually rose 60%, the increase being in gold and silver, which rose against the percentage of national bank and legal tender notes. Furthermore, Wells argued that the deflation only lowered the cost of goods that benefited from recent improved methods of manufacturing and transportation. Goods produced by craftsmen did not decrease in price, nor did many services, and the cost of labor actually increased. Also, deflation did not occur in countries that did not have modern manufacturing, transportation and communications. By the end of the 19th century, the deflation ended and turned to mild inflation. William Stanley Jevons predicted rising gold supply would cause inflation decades before it actually did. Irving Fisher blamed the worldwide inflation of the pre-WWI years on rising gold supply. In economies with an unstable currency, barter and other alternate currency arrangements such as dollarization are common, and therefore when the official money becomes scarce, commerce can still continue. Since in such economies the central government is often unable, even if it were willing, to adequately control the internal economy, there is no pressing need for individuals to acquire official currency except to pay for imported goods. In effect, barter acts as a protective tariff in such economies, encouraging local consumption of local production. It also acts as a spur to mining and exploration, because one easy way to make money in such an economy is to dig it out of the ground. Effects. Deflation was present during most economic depressions in U.S. history, deflation is generally regarded negatively, as it causes a transfer of wealth from borrowers and holders of illiquid assets, to the benefit of savers and of holders of liquid assets and currency, and because confused pricing signals malinvestment, in the form of underinvestment. In this sense it is the opposite of the more usual scenario of inflation, whose effect is to tax currency holders and lenders and use the proceeds to subsidize borrowers, including governments, and to cause malinvestment as overinvestment. Thus inflation encourages short-term consumption and can similarly overstimulate investment in projects that may not be worthwhile in real terms, while deflation retards investment even when there is a real-world demand not being met. In modern economies, deflation is usually caused by a drop in aggregate demand, and is associated with economic depression, as occurred in the Great Depression and the Long Depression. Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek, a libertarian Austrian economist, stated about the Great Depression deflation, "I agree with Milton Friedman that once the crash had occurred, the Federal Reserve System pursued a silly deflationary policy. I am not only against inflation but I am also against deflation." So, once again, a badly programmed monetary policy prolonged the depression. While an increase in the purchasing power of one's money benefits some, it amplifies the sting of debt for others. After a period of deflation, the payments to service a debt represent a larger amount of purchasing power than they did when the debt was first incurred. Consequently, deflation can be thought of as an effective increase in a loan's interest rate. If, as during the Great Depression in the United States, deflation averages 10% per year, even an interest-free loan is unattractive as it must be repaid with money worth 10% more each year. Under normal conditions, the Fed and most other central banks implement policy by setting a target for a short-term interest rate, the overnight federal funds rate in the U.S., and enforcing the target by buying and selling securities in open capital markets. When the short-term interest rate hits zero, the central bank can no longer ease policy by lowering its usual interest rate target. With interest rates near zero, debt relief becomes an increasingly important tool in managing deflation. In recent times, as loan terms have grown in length and loan financing is common among many types of investments, the costs of deflation to borrowers has grown larger. Deflation can discourage private investment because there is reduced expectations on future profits when future prices are lower. Consequently, with reduced private investments, spiraling deflation can cause a collapse in aggregate demand. Without the hidden risk of inflation, it may become more prudent for institutions to hold on to money, and not to spend or invest it. They are therefore rewarded by holding money. This hoarding behavior is seen as undesirable by most economists. As Hayek points out, it is agreed that hoarding money, whether in cash or in idle balances, is deflationary in its effects. No one thinks that deflation is in itself desirable. Some believe that, in the absence of large amounts of debt, deflation would be a welcome effect because the lowering of prices increases purchasing power. Since deflationary periods disfavor debtors, they are often periods of rising populist backlash. For example, in the late 19th century, populists in the U.S. wanted debt relief to move off the new gold standard and onto a silver standard, bimetal standard, or paper money like the recently ended greenbacks. Deflationary spiral. A deflationary spiral is a situation where decreases in price lead to lower production, which in turn leads to lower wages and demand, which leads to further decreases in price. Since reductions in general price level are called deflation, a deflationary spiral occurs when reductions in price lead to a vicious circle, where a problem exacerbates its own cause. In science, this effect is also known as a positive feedback loop. Another economic example of this principle is a bank run. The Great Depression was regarded by some as a deflationary spiral. A deflationary spiral is the modern macroeconomic version of the general glut controversy of the 19th century. Another related idea is Irving Fisher's theory that excess debt can cause a continuing deflation. Whether deflationary spirals can actually occur is controversial, with its possibility being disputed by freshwater economists and Austrian school economists. Counteracting deflation. During severe deflation, targeting an interest rate may be ineffective, because even lowering the short-term interest rate to zero may result in a real interest rate which is too high to attract credit-worthy borrowers. In the 21st century, a negative interest rate has been tried, but it can't be too negative, since people might withdraw cash from bank accounts if they have negative interest rate. Thus, the central bank must directly set a target for the quantity of money and may use extraordinary methods to increase the supply of money, e.g., purchasing financial assets of a type not usually used by the central bank as reserves. Before he was chairman of the United States Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke claimed in 2002, sufficient injections of money will ultimately always reverse a deflation. Although Japan's deflationary spiral was not broken by this very sort of quantitative easing, until the 1930s, it was commonly believed by economists that deflation would cure itself. As prices decreased, demand would naturally increase and the economic system would correct itself without outside intervention. This view was challenged in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Keynesian economists argued that the economic system was not self-correcting with respect to deflation and that governments and central banks had to take active measures to boost demand through tax cuts or increases in government spending. Reserve requirements from the central bank were high compared to recent times, so were it not for redemption of currency for gold, the central bank could have effectively increased money supply by simply reducing the reserve requirements and through open market operations to offset the reduction of money supply in the private sectors due to the collapse of credit. With the rise of monetarist ideas, the focus in fighting deflation was put on expanding demand by lowering interest rates. This view has received a setback in light of the failure of accommodative policies in both Japan and the US to spur demand after stock market shocks in the early 1990s and in 2002, respectively. Austrian economists worry about the inflationary impact of monetary policies on asset prices. Sustained low real rates can cause higher asset prices and excessive debt accumulation. Therefore, lowering rates may prove to be only a temporary palliative, aggravating an eventual debt deflation crisis. With interest rates near zero, debt relief becomes an increasingly important tool in managing deflation. Special borrowing arrangements. When the central bank has lowered nominal interest rates to zero, it can no longer further stimulate demand by lowering interest rates. This is the famous liquidity trap. When deflation takes hold, it requires special arrangements to lend money at a zero nominal rate of interest in order to artificially increase the money supply. Capital. Although the values of capital assets are often casually said to deflate when they decline, this usage is not consistent with the usual definition of deflation. A more accurate description for a decrease in the value of a capital asset is economic depreciation. Another term. The accounting conventions of depreciation are standards to determine a decrease in values of capital assets when market values are not readily available or practical.